This whole idea of, oh, it's all calories in, calories out, so it's all willpower. Like it's a horrible message. It's a horrible message. It's all different, right? In one case, you're going to get stronger, right? In one case, you're going to get fatter. And in one case, your metabolic rate's going to go up. Completely different from the same 100 calories.
The primary, recommendations and guidance from whether it's the FDA or the World Health Organization, that weight loss is primarily a math equation. And if you want to lose weight, it's just about eating less and exercising more, is really not, the full picture, and might actually be very misguided in its approach, because there's so many other aspects that go into weight gain, like insulin, the mechanism of insulin and how that plays into it. So it's important to understand calorie restriction and caloric restriction as a concept, but really we're talking about taking advantage of your body going into the right environment so it can go into repair mode.
Exactly. And that's the whole idea of this seesaw, right? You're either going sort of in growth mode, or you're going into sort of repair mode, right? And that's one of the things that it's been a real shift in the last sort of number of years, because of course this whole idea of rejuvenation, repair and stuff was probably only about 5 or 10 years. Like before that, everybody was like growth. So it's like, if that's what you want to do, then it's eat, which is, of course, then you wound up with this whole obesity epidemic, then this kind of thing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this whole calories debate is, to my mind, always a little bit silly. So the whole thing about calories is that it's not a concept from physiology. It's a concept from physics. So it's a unit of heat energy. That's purely what it is, right? But it doesn't tell you anything about what your body does with that energy. So for example, if you eat a block of wood, it has a number of calories, because if you burn it, it has a lot of calories, because it's energy. That's energy. But your body cannot do anything with it, right? So you eat a block of wood, it comes out your rectum, and that's it. That's all. There's no energy associated with it, even though within that wood there is a lot of potential energy. So it's the same thing, right? The calories, your body doesn't say, oh, you have this X number of calories, so I'm going to do this. No, your body has to translate that into something else. And that's that piece that's missing, right? It translates it into hormones, which is why you always have to look at the hormones, because that's sort of the language of the body. That's physiology, right? You can't take a unit of energy like physics and say, well, all calories are the same, because calories do different things. So that block of wood does nothing for you. If you eat a cookie, it's going to trigger off hormones that are incredibly different than if you were to eat, say, an egg, for example, right? So you eat protein and fat. The hormonal profile that you get is completely different than if you eat a cookie, which is completely different than if you eat a block of wood. Yet the calories are all equal. So how is that the same? Because those hormones are what tells our body what to do. Go into growth mode, go into repair mode, or don't do anything at all, right, with a piece of wood. So that whole thing about calories is, I say it just because that's what people are used to. It's easy for people to understand what's going on. But truthfully, the whole concept is quite useless to understand what's going on with the body. Like you take, 100 calories of cookies and 100 calories of an egg, for example, right? The minute those foods go into your mouth, the hormonal response is totally different. Therefore, our bodies are going to be doing something completely different with those two foods, even though they're the same calories, right? If your insulin goes up, your body says, store that calories as fat. If it doesn't go up, your body will say, take those calories and use them, burn it for energy, right? So it's totally different. And, I think that's where people get so messed up, is because we're so ingrained in this idea of calories, that calories are equal, because when you put them as the same thing, right? 100 calories of cookies, 100 calories of broccoli. Well, now they're both 100 calories, so you can treat them the same. You cannot treat them the same. There's no there's no physiologic way like that they are the same in any degree. Like, yes, there's an overlap. Sure, there's more overlap between that and 100 calories of wood, but those calories is nothing. It's just energy, right? What our body does with that energy is what's important. Do you store it as fat? Do you build new proteins, right? Do you just increase the metabolic rate and burn it as heat, for example? It's all different, right? In one case, you're going to get stronger, right? In one case, you're going to get fatter. And in one case, your metabolic rate's going to go up. Completely different from the same 100 calories.
It's such an important point. And this idea, which was really a theory, the calorie in, calorie out model of obesity and sort of why we gain weight, it's so indoctrinated into society that a lot of individuals, including well-established experts and doctors, took it as just settled science. And recently, there was a big paper that was done, a review paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by Dr. David Ludwig at Harvard, including a bunch of other doctors that were there too. And really, they took you through the whole journey of how we got there, how it was shaky science that sort of led to that understanding. And you've talked about this as well too, just highlighting it because that paper was published recently. We'll have the link in the show notes. And then all the way to the idea of understanding exactly what you shared about how hormones is the missing piece of the puzzle. When I read that and I hear your example, I often think about, NASA has the largest vacuum that they use to test devices that they're going to put in space. It's the largest vacuum in the world. And it's, I think it might be in Georgia, but I'll have to double check that. And if you take a bowling ball and you take a feather and you drop it in a vacuum, they both fall at the same rate. But in the real world, if you're in a Boeing 747 and you drop a bowling ball and a feather at the same time, they're not going to fall at the same rate. And our body is like that. It's a bunch of moving parts and pieces. It's not just physics that are in isolation. That's what I'm hearing from your message.
Well, exactly. And there's, I think the whole calories thing is sort of physics envy sort of thing, right? We want to be as clean and as precise as physics is, right? Because you look at physics, wow, they're building spaceships and, computers and all this stuff. And it's like, this is great, right? So physics is all very precise. It's all very math-based. And when physiology wants to be sort of, has all this physics envy, they're like, we want to be precise, just like physics. But then you ignore the whole messiness that is human physiology because does insulin go up? Take those 100 calories, right? Does insulin go up? Does it not go up? Does peptide YY, which is a satiety hormone, go up? Does it not go up? Do the stretch receptors in your stomach go up or down if you eat a big fibrous meal, like a big, if you eat a lot of, say vegetables and your stomach stretches out? Well, it doesn't have any calories because you could eat hair and your stomach will stretch and turn on your satiety signals, right? So there's stretch receptors in the stomach. Do those 100 calories, do they increase cholecystokinin, which is in response to fat, for example? What does it do to leptin? Like it's messy like crazy, but that's reality, right? And all it means is that, because every food is going to have a different hormonal profile, all it says is that certain foods for the same number of calories are more fattening than others, which is actually just common sense, right? I don't think anybody would really doubt that cookies and ice cream is more fattening than salmon and salad. It's hard to get fat eating salad. It just is, right? So that's very common sense. It's totally in line with what the physiology is, that, hey, all these foods have different hormonal profiles. Some are going to lead to more body increasing fat stores, right? And others are not. So therefore, some foods are more fattening than others. That's all it says, right? I don't see how that's so non-scientific. Because some people say, oh, you're a calorie denier or something like that. I'm like, I'm just telling you that calories is not a concept of physiology. It's a concept of physics. And it's this whole idea that they are equal And this whole idea of, creating a caloric deficit. I mean, that's another really stupid idea, I have to say. So this idea of, to lose weight, you have to create a caloric deficit. Now, that's always true. The question is, how do you create the caloric deficit? Remember, when you take that energy balance equation, you have body fat, which is a storage form of energy, right? It's a storage form of calories. It's stored calories. That's basically what it is. Body fat equals calories in, calories out. So when you look at that, it's inequality, right? X equals A plus B or whatever, right? So body fat equals calories in minus calories out. That's always true. The question is, so it's not two things. You have three variables there. And those always have to balance. So you can never have a deficit. You either have storage, you have calories in, you have calories out. So the question is, how do you create that inequality? If you want to lose body fat, you want to have calories in minus calories out. So that's true. So, but then they take that next step and they say, therefore, all you have to do is reduce your calories in. Well, two things can happen when you reduce those calories in. Either, right? So you have three things. You have storage, you have calories in, you have calories out. So you reduce calories in. Two possible things can happen. Either body fat goes down, which is what they tell you is going to happen, or, which is perfectly in line with math, right? Either when calories in goes down, either body fat goes down or calories out goes down. Both are possibilities because there's three variables here. What they don't tell you, which is what the science of the last 100 years has told you, is that every time you reduce calories in just by focusing on calories and not focusing on the hormones, what happens is not that the body fat goes down, but that the calories out or your metabolic rate goes down. So we know this from, I don't know, there's hundreds of years of research of this. The first research looking at this was from 1917. So more than 100 years ago, they showed this exact thing. Reduce calories in, reduce calories out. Your calories out goes down. So you take 2,000 calories in, drops down to 1,500, right? So two things can happen. Either your body loses 500 calories of body fat or your metabolic rate goes down by 500. Guess which one almost always happens? Is that the calories out goes down. That's just science. We know that. We've been proven that over and over again. So therefore, the question is not about whether or not a caloric deficit reduces body fat. Yes, it does. The question is, how do you create that caloric deficit? You cannot do that by reducing calories in. You similarly cannot reduce it by trying to increase calories out by exercising, which is the other thing that people always talk about. Because yes, when you exercise, you are going to increase the rate of energy that your skeletal muscles will use. But there's all these other parts of your body that exercise does nothing for. So there's your bladder, there's your kidneys. Like, does exercising increase the metabolic rate of your kidneys? Not in the least. Your liver, your heart, your lungs, your brain. Like, there's all these other organ systems that use energy all the time. The skeletal muscle is only a single system, right? So yeah, if you exercise for 6 hours a day, you can sort of overwhelm that effect. But remember, most of us are, say, burning 2,000 calories a day. You go for a run or something, you might burn what? You've seen those treadmills. That calorie counter goes up really, really slowly, right? So if you have somebody, okay, so you burn 200 calories, 300 calories, like, you're not even at 10% of what your body does using your kidneys, your liver, your body heat generation, all that kind of thing. So this idea that you're going to exercise your way out of it is also similarly false. And the other thing is that, remember, there's three variables. You increase your calories out by exercising, two things can happen. One is that you're going to take that energy from your body fat stores. That's what they want to happen. That's what almost never happens. What happens is that you eat more, right? And that's perfectly in balance with this energy balance equation. Three variables. They always only look at two of them, right? As if one of them is fixed, as if your calories out are fixed. And that's the whole thing that these people never seem to understand. I don't know why. It's very obvious when you just, put it out. There's three legs on this stool, right? You change one of the other two can change. It's not for sure that, they say Body fat equals calories in minus calories out. Reduce calories in, calories out. If it stays stable, then you'll lower your body fat. But it doesn't stay stable. That's the problem.
Yeah, it seems that when things are built on consensus understanding, it's much more difficult for people to keep an open mind and ask the most fundamental of questions, because it's, how could we question this? This is what we've been spending all our time, effort, and energy. And a lot of people would have to raise their hand, which is actually a beautiful part of science, but it takes a lot of courage, and say, actually, I think we got it wrong. I need to start asking these most fundamental of questions, but that's hard to do when so much of your life, your work, your research, your advocacy has been built on one specific way of looking at it. But the beautiful thing is, especially with, I love, every time I go on YouTube, I love watching your channel, and I love it for two reasons. Besides the fact that you just give incredible information, I'm like, this is an incredible education tool for the person who's out there who doesn't know about all the debates that are there. They just want to improve their health. They're just trying to break free of obesity or type 2 diabetes or feel a little bit better. And they've been trying, and they've been following the standard advice for years. And they actually feel like a failure because everybody around them has been telling them, you're not doing it hard enough, or maybe even you're lying. Maybe you're secretly cheating.
Yeah.
Maybe you're not cutting your food enough, and you're not exercising enough. And that is a failed message. So I'm just so happy that people can get information that actually can make a huge difference in their life directly from the sources of individuals who are willing to ask and re-question what they were taught about in school. So just another way of me saying that I'm grateful for your work and message.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And I I try to talk about a lot of this sort of physiological stuff on my YouTube channel. Like, talking about things, for example, last week I was talking about sort of the role of monotony in diets and varieties, and, how variety actually makes it more, harder to lose weight because you've got all these sort of delicious foods, because we eat sort of for two reasons, right? You eat for hunger, but you also eat for pleasure, right? So if you take away the pleasure because you're eating the same thing day after day after day, then you're just going to eat for hunger. When you do that, you stop eating as soon as you're not hungry anymore. And that's going to play a role in the end. So you have these drugs, for example, that can suppress the appetite. Nicotine probably is a classic one, right? You just didn't really want to eat as much when you smoked. So people lost weight. And then when they stopped smoking, of course, they gained some weight. But, obviously that's not good for you. But the other thing is that, this whole idea of, it's all calories in, calories out, so it's all willpower. Like, it's a horrible message. It's a horrible message, because now you have all these people who, they listen to them and they say, okay, I cut 500 calories a day. And what happens, of course, is that their metabolic rate goes down. So your body burns 500 calories less, then the weight loss stops. But because you're burning 500 calories a day less, you feel horrible. You have no energy, you're feeling cold all the time. So you increase that a little bit. So instead of, going 500 down, you go say, I'm going to eat 300 less. But your body has burning 500 less. So now you're regaining that weight, right? So, but instead of those people saying, there's something wrong with this treatment of just cutting 500 calories a day, instead of that, they say, well, you must be cheating on your diet. It's your own fault, right? And it's like, no, it never was. All these millions of women who blame themselves for the failure of their diet when the blame should have been on the diet, the calorie restricted, low fat diet, eating 6 times a day. Those were the things that were the problem, instead they were trying to shift that blame onto them, which was horribly destructive, right? You have people with, emotional problems and self-esteem problems, all because they thought that obesity equals sort of lack of willpower, right? And it was a horrible message, and it's still promoted by a lot of these sort of fitness guys and stuff, because they don't understand the sort of science of, hey, if you take 500 calories a day less, you could either 1, lose body fat, or 2, lower your metabolic rate by 500 calories. And option 2 is 95% of people go, their bodies tend towards option 2. So therefore, that's not good. You're not going to lose body fat. Your body fat stays the same. Your metabolic rate goes down. It's not a failure of willpower. They're still doing that diet, right? Like on that show, The Biggest Loser, for example. It's always interesting to me because you look at them and they're doing all this stuff. They've got obviously lots of willpower. Like their minds will do it if they set themselves to it, right? They'll run until they puke, sort of thing. You can see it. And yet, we're supposed to believe that these people gain weight because they had no willpower. But just look at them. They clearly have a lot of willpower. It wasn't a failure of willpower. It was a failure of understanding that this sort of approach of calorie restriction without understanding the hormones is actually a failed sort of theory. It doesn't work. And it's not that it falls outside of thermodynamics, right? There's 3 variables here. Either of those 2 things will satisfy that condition. So therefore, you have to do something else. And that's why I talk a lot about it. Sort of, I get very sort of into it because I think it's so unfair to blame these people. It's like, think about it this way. Suppose you have a classroom of 100 children and one of them fails. Sure, that might be his fault or her fault. Maybe they didn't study. Maybe they were lazy. But what if all of a sudden you have 70 kids who fail? Do you think all of those kids were lazy? Or is it the teacher's fault? Because I think it's more likely the teacher's fault. So you take the same thing and say, okay, you have Americans or North Americans or the world for that matter now, because it's becoming a worldwide thing. And if only a few people are obese, you might say, well, those are lazy people. But if now 50, 60, 70% of the world is obese, it's not an individual failure. It's a failure of the system. You got to look at the system and say, what is it that we're doing, which is sort of focusing obsessively on calories? What is it that we're doing that we could do better? Because if we can do that, then we will have served those 50, 60, 70% of people. Instead, we don't. We say our system is perfect. It's all calories in, calories out. It's all willpower. You're just not following the advice. And we turn that blame, which should have fallen onto the system, onto the people who are suffering, which is just blaming the victim. And that's the problem I have with a lot of these things, is that it's all blaming the victim. It's all trying to turn our own failures as a scientific community, our own failure to understand the hormonal basis of obesity, and we're trying to turn the blame onto these people who are suffering from it, right? And it's like, if you're blaming people, you're not helping them. Like, it's not going to work right that, right? And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of academic medicine and, you look at a lot of these, USDA guidelines, just eat less. Like it's like, yeah, that's not going to work. Like, that advice is not useful. If it was useful, I'd be the first one to give it. But it's not useful. It hasn't been useful. It has never been useful. So let's do better, right? That's what I always think. If we can figure out what part of the environment is driving this evolutionary process, then that's how we're going to reduce the risk of cancer. And so the question is, what is it in our environment? So they've studied this question for a long time. So back in 1981, they did a study where they're going to estimate the risks. So we do something called a population attribution factor, which is what percentage a certain risk factor will contribute to cancer. So tobacco smoke is the biggest, 35%. So tobacco is responsible roughly for 35% of cancer overall. But number 2 was the diet at around 30%, right? So really, like, very, very close to tobacco and dwarfing almost everything else. So all the stuff like the pesticides and the chemicals and stuff, that's like 1 or 2%, radiation 1 or 2%. But cancer was caused in large part due to 1, tobacco, which we know about, and 2, the diet. The question is,
never really got that. Like, people didn't get that, like
people didn't.
They didn't get that.
And so they were looking for what part of the diet. That was what the tricky part was. So if it's diet, then what part of the diet is causing cancer, right? So they looked at fiber, wasn't the case. They looked at dietary fat, it wasn't the case. They looked at vitamin deficiencies. And we've done so many studies like vitamin A, vitamin B, folic acid, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, omega-3 fatty acids, selenium. We've tested all of those in multi-million-dollar trials, and it wasn't deficiency of vitamins that was causing cancer. And the answer came somewhere around 2000. What part of the diet was the most important? And we didn't know this really until about 2003. And it turns out that it was obesity was the biggest driver of cancer. And probably more specifically is that it was the hyperinsulinemia. That is the too much insulin, which is very typical of obesity, is probably the what's driving cancer in those cases. And the reason I say we didn't know is because, so I went to medical school in the mid-1990s, and we never talked about this stuff.
No.
But in 2003, a very large study came out, which showed that obesity actually raises the risk of all kinds of cancer. So now the WHO classifies 13 different types of cancer as obesity related, including breast cancer and colorectal cancer, which are after lung cancer, sort of the most common cancers. So really, really important causes. And this is what's important is now, what we're doing is we have to go past again. So this paradigm, which gets us to evolution, which gets us to the seed and the soil, which is this sort of evolutionary ecology being the study of how the environment interacts with an individual, how you can change that environment in order to prevent cancer. And that's sort of what's sort of exciting about this is that now hopefully we can start to understand and then make some changes that are going to minimize our risk of developing these types of cancers and, hopefully preventing them in the future.
Yeah. And I mean, and even question basic premises. I was on the Mayo Clinic website in preparation of this interview. There's like a myths and there's like a myths and facts section on cancer and diet. And like one of the questions inside there was sugar, somebody saying, does consuming less sugar have any impact on cancer? Right. And it was like, there's no research, there's no evidence at all that consuming less sugar has anything to do with cancer. And again, Mayo Clinic, well-established place. They're doing the best they can based on the research and the evidence that's out there right now. And part of the thing that you're bringing in is that highlighting, especially with your previous books, that we're really talking about, insulin resistance and what that relates to, diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, is, well, if we know that obesity through this big study that you were talking about plays a major factor, and then what is it as part of that also contributes to obesity, and how do cancer cells get their energy, then of course we're going to want to pay attention to the level of sugars as one example that we're having inside of our diet, because that's going to cause a whole chain of effects that ultimately supports the growth of cancer.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of so Dr. Lou Cantley, who's a very prominent researcher, cancer researcher, he was one of the ones who sort of uncovered the link between sort of what sugar does, which is, it contributes to this high insulin state. And insulin, other than being a metabolic hormone, is actually a very, very potent growth factor. So it tells cells to grow. And if you're going to tell cells to grow, then you're going to tip the scales in towards, increasing growth of cancer cells, for example. So, here's a guy who's sort of like one of the most prominent cancer researchers, and he's like, sugar scares me. That's what he says in one of his articles he's written. It's like, okay, well, that's all I need to know, right?
Totally. And also too, on the basic premise of like, what is chemotherapy, right?
Yeah.
Could you explain like that link on that? Like, how do they get these well-intentioned poisons into cancer cells? Can you explain that to like our audience through, like exactly like what goes into chemotherapy that takes advantage of exactly that we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So when you look at the cancer cells, you can do something called a PET test, which is a positron emission test. And it basically looks at how how avidly cells take up glucose. So when you do these tests, things that light up are eating a lot of glucose, and those are what are identified as cancer. So they're taking in, like 5 or 10 times the amount of glucose, which is a type of sugar compared to normal cells. So it's like, okay, when you look on these sophisticated sort of scans, you can see the cancer cells basically devouring sugar like there's no tomorrow. And it's like, well, if I had cancer, I certainly wouldn't be trying to eat too much of the stuff, because that the one place in the body that loves it 10 times more than the next guy is the thing, right? And then you have certain chemotherapies which take advantage of this. They try and get in, because they're, they mimic the sugar, and that's how they do it on the positron emission tomography testing, for example. They mimic the sugar so that the cancer takes it up, and then it lights it up. And then people are trying to use that to sort of target the cancers as well. But interesting, it's an interesting story of how this sort of this new paradigm explains so much more about the phenomenon of cancer, and how, what implications it has for screening, and this sort of evolution of, and this is sort of the promise of this cancer paradigm 3.0, is that if you now understand that what is happening now is that the cell is evolving away from normal cells, evolving into a foreign species. Because, and people always think, oh, that's so weird, right? But that's the way the body actually looks at the cancer cells. So when our immune system looks at a cell, it has a way to tell between self and non-self. That is, the immune system is a very powerful weapon. You don't want to use it on its own cells. That's like friendly fire, right? So you want to
type behavior.
Exactly. And it's very, very bad if that happens. So your body has these ways to distinguish between your own cells and everybody else. So bacteria, viruses, it will try and kill it. And when it sees a cancer, it will try and kill it. That's just the way, that's what happens. So it has evolved, this cell. So say you take a lung cell. This lung cell, which was originally your own cell, has evolved into basically a new species that is foreign. That's why
Frankenstein in your own body.
Exactly. And that's the reason that instead of trying, so the third paradigm, which is like, okay, now we have these cells that were originally part of us, but they've basically broken away and they've become their own sort of, invader. Now you say, well, instead of trying to just get indiscriminate killing, which was paradigm 1, or genetic targeting, which was paradigm 2, now what we're going to do is enhance the immune system to identify it. So basically you have these sleeper cells, like, you have terrorists, sleeper cells of terrorists in your city. And now what you're trying to do is uncover them so that you can get your police and your SWAT teams in there to kill these sort of domestic terrorists. That's what we're doing with immunotherapy. So these new drugs, these checkpoint inhibitors, are basically uncovering. So there are certain ways that these cancer cells hide, and they're basically trying to uncover them, right? And this is the new paradigm. What we're going to do is trying to uncover these sleeper cells, these hidden sleeper cells, so that they can be identified, targeted. We can, direct the immune system. So something like those new drugs you're talking about, the, those checkpoint inhibitors, then you get CAR T, where you're actually going to take the cancer and then engineer sort of a SWAT team that is going to identify and kill them, right? That's a new therapy based on this immunotherapy, but it's based more specifically on this new paradigm of looking at a cancer as a new foreign species. And it's very, very interesting because, it's the promise is sort of immense. Like, we're not there yet. And I hope that there's a lot more to come. But it's a totally new way of targeting cancer and treating it based on a whole new paradigm. And that's what gives me hope for the future, that there's more going to be able to be applied, because you can apply these lessons of evolutionary biology and say, well, what can I do to change the environment, for example, because that's evolution, that's biology. So things like losing weight and, intermittent fasting, which is another way to lose weight, trying to reverse your type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetics, of course, get much higher rates of cancer because it's also hyperinsulinemic. So reversing the type 2 diabetes, that's going to likely reduce your risk. To other things like chemo preventative agents. So there's not a lot. They've been studying stuff to try and prevent cancer, but there's not a lot. So the only things that might work, metformin gets a lot of research, which is a diabetes drug, may be useful. And then green tea, probably a very small effect, but there's some data from Japan where they do drink a lot of green tea, that some of the compounds in that are maybe effective. So maybe that's a great thing to do. Drinking green tea is probably good anyway.
And really the two central themes that I got out of your book after really going through that history is, one, the future is hopeful in a way that is really understanding more of that central question, coming back to how we started off the podcast, which is what the heck is cancer? So we're better shaped for what we're developing in terms of treatments and drugs in the future, because we have the most robust answer that's actually getting to the source and the root of what is cancer. And the second component is exactly kind of what you were just talking about, which is what are the things that you can do today to both enhance, whether it's some of the work of like Walter Longo or other people that are out there that are showing that fasting could support, right? Targeted fasting, especially before chemotherapy, can support and enhance the potency of these drugs if somebody actively has cancer. Cutting off the source of the supply of food, which is significantly reducing the amount of glucose so that we're not in this place of, hyperinsulinemia. And if you don't have cancer right now, and this is something that you're paying attention to in the future, what would be your biggest recommendations? Somebody who's healthy, who's listening to this podcast right now, and they're like, wow, this is all super fascinating. I've never understood this before, but now I get it. It's almost like you just gave us a master class on cancer. What are the one or two things to do today, besides not smoking, that will help us be the most resilient to potentially avoid this disease in the future or greatly minimize our risk?
Yeah, and so you get back to those sort of attributable risk, which is number one is tobacco smoke. So of course that's probably the single most important thing, and still is to not smoke. And then two is the diet. So avoiding hyperinsulinemia, which is that sort of what I talk about more in the obesity code and the type 2 diabetes, in the diabetes code, is that insulin is this hormone which tends to make us gain weight and also causes insulin resistance. And too much insulin is a very potent growth factor. So that's going to. So if you want to avoid things that are going to raise insulin, which is eating a diet that is very high in refined carbohydrates, for example, sugar is probably something you should best take in small amounts. And then this other idea is that you really should be having a regular period of fasting every day. That's really sort of basic. It's the word breakfast. It's the meal that breaks your fast, because really you're supposed to be eating at, say, dinner time, which is, say, 6 o'clock, and eating at breakfast time, which is maybe 8 o'clock. So you're getting somewhere between 12 and 14 hours of fasting every single day. That's what's supposed to happen. That's buried in the word breakfast, right? Break fast. That is what's supposed to happen every day. That's not what happens to most of us in 2020. Because if you look at sort of societal norms and stuff, instead of having 3 meals and then no snacks, we sort of graze throughout the day, believing that it's actually healthy for us. I don't think it is, because every time you are eating, you're stimulating your insulin, which is giving growth signals to the cells, including the cancer cells, which love insulin. You look at a breast cancer cell, for example, has like 5 or 6 times the number of insulin receptors compared to a normal breast cell. They love this stuff. They love insulin. They love glucose. So therefore, you want to lower it. So eating sort of whole unprocessed foods is important. That's probably the most important thing. Not eating all the time is probably the second most important thing. And maintaining a normal weight as best as you can. I mean, that's not always the easiest thing to do, But if you are overweight, then try to lose that weight. If you are type 2 diabetic, try to reverse that type 2 diabetes. And that's the two, the tobacco and the diet are so overwhelmingly more important than everything else. Like you could also, look at the viruses, for example. You can get the, try to avoid the hepatitis B and hepatitis C, which cause cancer, and human papillomavirus. But those are sort of givens. But the diet and the tobacco are sort of in a class of their own. Everything else is like 2%, and they're at like 35%.
And I think I just want to say, from somebody from the outside who's been an observer of your work and consuming it and just super appreciative, the cigarette piece is easy, tough to break, but actually there's really a lot of really interesting stuff that's coming out of Johns Hopkins and other places of using psychedelics to help break cigarette cessation. Maybe those things we'll incorporate and we'll figure out new ways to help people. I think it's about 15% of the adult population smokes here in the United States. So it's gone down massively, and cancer rates have gone down for that. The diet, sometimes people listening here, if they're not familiar with your work, can think, okay, he's just talking about eating healthy, but really you're talking about getting out of this central paradigm, to use the word, where we're eating sugar in all its other forms. So people who are listening are like, I don't really have a lot of sugar in my diet, maybe a little bit in my coffee, some birthday cake here and there when I'm at parties. But, how often are you eating those meals of refined starches that are a regular part of our daily life? The big bowls of rice or ultra processed foods or breads or other things like that fine, have those things every so often as, parts of your diet. But when they become the norm, now you understand why so much of America is in that pre-diabetic state where they think they might be eating healthy because they're just a little bit overweight, but actually their diet is constantly spiking their blood sugar, which leads to all these problems with insulin that you're talking about. So you're not just talking about eating healthy, let's be a little bit more mindful. You're talking about really actually leaning in and getting your blood sugar under control.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the ways, a lot of people talk about diets, and there's all these different opinions on diets, but what people hadn't focused on really at all, I think, until a few years ago, was this meal timing. That is eating all the time really the same as eating, a few times? And I think the answer is no, because the point is that you need to let your body sort of digest, let your insulin levels fall so that you don't get all these problems with the insulin resistance and so on. Because insulin is not intrinsically bad, but it is a hormone that goes up when you eat. So if you eat constantly, is that a bad thing? And that's not been talked about a lot. And that's what I've really focused on, is that I think it's actually highly detrimental to be eating constantly. It's just not the way that you're supposed to be doing it. And we've never done it.
Which was a little bit of the trend of some of the advice, especially in like the 90s and 2000s, eat 6 meals a day, graze throughout the day. And really, we're backing away from that largely through the work that people like yourself are doing and just educating. Well, let's actually look, is this actually helpful or could it be harmful? And it's looking like it's not supportive of our overall health goals inside the body.
Yeah. I think the whole idea was sort of silly that you should eat to lose weight. And it's like, well, how's that going to work exactly? Right? If you're eating all the time, how are you expecting to lose weight? And of course, that if you eat a little bit and then stop, that doesn't suppress your appetite. It increases it. That's what an appetizer is. It's a small portion of food to make you more hungry, not less hungry, more hungry, right? So if you're going to eat small portions of food, you're going to stimulate your appetite, then you're going to stop, right? It's like when you start urinating, you just want to finish, right? When you start eating, you just want to finish. If you were to go pee and you just stop and start and stop and start, it's like, why would you want to do that? Like, that's the dumbest thing ever, right? So it's like you're going to make yourself hungry by taking a little appetizing portion of food, and then you're going to stop, right? It's like, oh, Well, that's not really useful. And then you're going to do it again and again and again, 6 times a day. Well, why would you want to do that? That's ridiculous because it's never been done before. Because prior to like 1977, nobody did that. So why would you even think that it's a good thing to do? Like, why would you even come up with that? And the answer is that there was no real scientific evidence that it actually helpful. It was just sort of made up. People just thought it might be good and they just said it and that's it.
Sure. Well, there's that old saying that I don't know who discovered water, but it probably wasn't a fish. Sometimes we're so in the cultural norms of the way that things have been done that it actually takes a lot of courage, especially for somebody in your position, to step back and say, wait, does any of this make sense? Let's start with the basics and let's question the premise and then go from there. If not, we're in this rat race where today, still in the US, unfortunately, number one reason for bankruptcy is medical bills. Cancer rates are continuing to go up. Quality of life is not increasing. Out of 90% of our insurance dollars that we pay in, young people, old people, everybody, out of all the insurance dollars that we pay in, 90% of it is used in the last 6 to 8 months of somebody's life to try to keep them alive through these expensive treatments. A lot of them well-intentioned, that are there. Some maybe coming from business perspectives, but it's not a winning race. We have to step back and we have to question the basic idea. And that's exactly, Dr. Fung, what you do.
Fasting, interestingly enough, has always been sort of used as this way of staying healthy, right? You look back at all these traditions that we have and, so like religious fasting, for example. So, in most religions, they have a period of fasting. And of course, at the time that these religions were established, there's not a lot of obesity. In fact, starvation is the predominant, is much more common than obesity back, say, 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, whenever these religions, and there's tons of them, right, that do the fasting. So it's interesting because when they talk about the fasting, it's a form of like they're not trying to punish themselves, right? It's not that they're trying to do something bad. They're usually trying to do something healthy for the body. So whether you're talking Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or, whatever it is, sometimes it's couched in terms of sort of self-denial, but a lot of times it's just something it's supposed to be sort of intrinsically healthy for you. And it's interesting because this is outside of weight loss. So for North Americans, particularly, the weight loss thing is a huge impact. Like that's a huge health benefit right there from fasting. So, but in terms of longevity, it may be that also it's going to have like this massive improvement in longevity by doing something, and it's sort of always been recognized that it is something that's healthy for you, whether they talk about a detox or whether you talk about a purification or a cleansing or something. It's always termed in the same way that it's something that you're sort of clearing out the old junk sort of thing. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what autophagy is. So in the last sort of 10 years, we've actually recognized the science behind all of this old sort of terminology of cleansing and detoxification, that, hey, maybe it's actually true. Maybe we've only just sort of put the scientific term on what all these other people who, they didn't know the science, but they knew the benefits of what they were doing and then codified it within these religious practices that various people follow. So it's an interesting way to look at it. So not only, as you said, with the health, in terms of weight loss and all that stuff, that's immediately obvious, but there may be that sort of hidden thing that takes a little longer for people to understand. Yeah, hey, this is something that's really, really highly beneficial for us.
Let's talk about caloric restriction and the importance of, first of all, for people that don't know what it is, just explaining, and how it fits in to the conversation that we're having here.
Yeah, so caloric restriction is probably the only really well-established scientific way of increasing longevity. And it's mostly animal studies. So they do this in animal studies. They take rats or something, and they have one that eats whatever they want and one group where they restrict how much they eat. And the group that restricts how much they eat generally live longer. So fruit flies, and they've done it in all kinds of animals. So that this has been shown for ages. And that was sort of this really interesting, and the first studies that came out with, came out like, 30, 40 years ago, as a real shock to people, because people thought, well, hey, if you're more nourished, right, more nutrients, more vitamins, you're going to live longer. But they didn't. They all live shorter. And that was quite a shock. And this is that whole, that's what sort of is that whole seesaw between growth and longevity sort of thing. So caloric restriction is well established in most animal models as a way to increase longevity. In humans, of course, it's really hard to do those studies. There was a few inadvertent sort of ways to do it, but the problem is that you have to go between malnourishment. You don't want to get malnourished, so there's this continuum between calorie restriction, which is okay, and malnourishment, where you're just not getting enough vitamins and minerals and stuff, and then you actually do very badly. So sometimes they've crossed over. There was a couple of biosphere experiments where they sort of crossed that line. I think, remember those old experiments where people would live in this contained dome and stuff. And it was a little controversial at the time, but they wound up sort of fairly severely calorie restricting themselves. And it wasn't always pretty. It wasn't great. So that was sort of an inadvertent human experiment into it. A fascinating sort of study for thing to look at sort of 20 years ago. But the whole idea is that if you are well nourished, as most people in North America say are, then the calorie restriction may actually improve your lifespan and health span by a fairly significant amount. So caloric restriction, and the question then is, how do you do it? And this is one of the big questions. So you can do it like the Okinawans do it, where you say, I am going to sort of eat to 80%. And so you impose that sort of structure so that you can do it. If you don't impose any kind of structure and you think day to day, I'm just going to stop eating, a little bit. If you have to keep thinking about it, it's never going to work. Fasting is another way, of course, to impose that sort of caloric restriction by giving you the structure. So if you say, I'm not going to eat today, then you're almost automatically going to, calorie restrict yourself. There's some interesting studies on fasting where they try to get around that, because people always try to say, well, is it the fasting or is it the calories? It's like, I don't really care. Like, if you do fasting properly, then you are going to be calorie restricted, right? But so what? If I tell people, okay, cut 500 calories a day, and it just doesn't work to lose weight, then it doesn't matter. It's just a failed strategy. So why do I care that if I can do it through fasting, that I reduce 500 calories a day by saying, I'm just going to eat once a day, and that's going to do a 500 calorie a day restriction. If it's successful, it's successful. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not you restrict calories, how you restrict calories. If it works, right? So don't worry about it so much. So there's some interesting studies lately that have tried to look at fasting. What they do is they try to get around that whole calorie part by saying, okay, you'll fast, but then you'll eat more when you're eating. I'm like, but that's not really the point of it, right? The whole point of the fasting is that when you're not eating, you're going to activate these mechanisms. You're going to get rid of some of this old stuff. You don't need to eat more because you're using up your body fat and all that sort of stuff. So the calorie restriction part of things is certainly part of the fasting. So therefore, I think you just have to take it all together, and rather than try to sort of tease it out and say, well, is it the calories? Is it the fasting? It's all part of the same thing. So it's just not that easy. If you eat once a day, or if you eat once every 2 days, it's not easy to pack all those 3 meals into a single one.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed this mashup, you're going to love this interview with my dear friend Ben Bickman on the science of actually how we lose weight. It's fascinating. Check it out.
So insulin resistance it really is an epidemic that is the single most common health disorder in the world. In the US alone, it affects potentially